The topic I have been assigned is God is on the move. How does Europe fit in? A very intriguing topic, and I'm going to reflect on this topic briefly on three perspectives. First, God is on the move. What is he doing? Where is he on the move? Secondly, what does it mean for the regions of the world, for the churches, for the believers, the believing community in all the regions of the world, that God is working his purposes out? And then lastly, I will reflect on the topic itself. Where does Europe fit in God's plan for the world? This map was supposed to represent the phenomenon which occurred in the 20th century, the sort of mantra in missiology led by the doyen of modern missiology or contemporary missiology, Andrew Walls of Scotland. And the mantra is that there has been a global shift, a paradigm shift in the center of gravity of Christian presence in the world throughout the 20th century, from Europe and the West to what is called the global South, Africa and Asia and the lands of the Caribbean. Asia is part of the global East, but has phenomenon, characteristics of the global South. So this map was really to portray this shift and provide us with a perspective on how the shift has taken place over a century, from 1910 to 2010. At the center of this religious demographic study in religious demographics, the Pew Center in the United States has been at the forefront of this research in religious demography. There are the centers here in Europe, as well as in the United States. Gordon Conwell, the Center for Global Christianity at Gordon Conwell in Boston, is also a major center for data on the global shift of Christianity. And what it really is projecting in percentage terms is how Christianity has shifted from Europe to Africa and Asia and Latin America to the global South. Shifted in terms of the percentage of people who are coming to faith in Christ, percentage of the number of churches that are being planted across the world. So for a century, from 1910 to 2010, there has been a major shift in the world of Christian presence towards the global South. So again, we will try and get you these images so that you can have a look on your own screen, and you will see that in that century, 1910, which was when the first major global conference on Christian mission took place in Scotland, in Edinburgh. When that took place, who was present? What was the status of Christianity in the world at that time, at the beginning of the 20th century, to 2010, when the major conference, major congress on world evangelization that was hosted and organized by the Lausanne movement in Africa. Significantly, the first Congress, 1910, was in Europe, and in 2010, the third Congress was held in Scotland. And you will see that there has been a major shift. By about 60% of Christian presence has moved south. So I want to really begin my presentation not just with that perspective of the shift that has occurred in the 20th century. And here we are now emerging in the 21st century. What's going on? And I want to start with something that occurred in Europe in 2009 to 2012 and up to last year, when the French presidential election took place with the election of Emmanuel Macron. It's a presentation in which political scientists, political theorists have been working on a project of imagining a world without Europe. So we're coming to that. So that's part of my introduction, and then I will move on to speak about in what way is God moving in the world, in Africa, in Asia, in the Pacific, in the Americas, in Eurasia, in Europe, throughout the world. And then, of course, the next part of the presentation will be how does Europe fit into this scheme of things? And then I will make some conclusions. The fundamental question for Europe is this. Is the church in Europe, is the European church drowning in a tidal wave of modern culture? Or is it riding the wave of the modern missionary challenge? That's the question that's facing the church in Europe. Is the church drowning in a tidal wave of modern culture? Is culture overwhelming the church? Or is the church riding the wave of the modern missionary challenge? And I want to give you the summary of my presentation, so if you hear nothing else, at least you know what is it I was intending to say. God is on the move throughout the world in many ways. This is His world, and we want to discern what God is doing in the world, and we want, by God's grace, to be part of that, to be part of His move. God is moving throughout the world in the amazing way in the context of the mass migration of peoples throughout the world and in the refugee crisis that is affecting the world, significantly here in Europe, but also throughout Asia, throughout Latin America, throughout Africa. People are on the move throughout the Americas. Migration and immigration is one of those major political issues that governments are faced with. But people are on the move all across the world. And this presents tremendous opportunity for the gospel. There is new openness to the gospel. There's a planting of what we call diaspora churches, because Christians are part of this migration wave. And when they move with their churches. So one of the phenomena we will look at is diaspora churches, African churches in Europe and in Latin America. In Chile, in South America, around Santiago, there are 1.5 million Palestinian Christians moved away from Palestine, obviously because of the conflict and because of the difficulties. And they've moved as far away as to Chile in South America. Many are across Europe as well. So the planting of diaspora churches, the Canadian government and the Syrian crisis, they've taken in 25,000 Syrians into Canada. And it's amazing how they have assimilated in the populations across Canada and what they're doing in respect to the religion that they're practicing in the new environment in which they find themselves. God is at work through this phenomenon of the mass movement of people through the refugee crisis and through mass migration. The planting of diaspora churches and also in the awakening of the church to cross-cultural mission. So in the 19th century, in the 20th century, the gospel was from the West to the rest of the world. I mean, I was just reflecting yesterday with Greg and a few others, how in the 19th century, the beginning of the modern missionary movement in the world, Europe was at the forefront. Every major city in Europe had a mission society. In Oslo, in Bremen, in London, in Paris, in Edinburgh. David Livingstone went to Africa as a sort of a trailblazer, a pioneer missionary in the mid-19th century out of the Edinburgh Missionary Society and the London Missionary Society. So every major city in Europe in the 19th century had a mission society. They recruited, trained, and commissioned missionaries from Europe. and from the United States. Similarly, in Boston, in New York, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, there were mission societies in these major cities in the 19th century. So it was mission from the West to the rest. Here we are in the 21st century. What is the paradigm of mission? It is from everywhere to everywhere. So the Korean church is raising up, recruiting and raising over 1,000 missionaries to be deployed around the world. The Chinese church is doing likewise. The Brazilian church is doing likewise. The African church is doing likewise. And I will mention what God is doing in Latin America. We were just at a conference of the continental movement in Latin America, in Bogota, in Colombia. And out of their congress last August, 25,000 missionaries are being raised up on the continent of Latin America to be sent out to the rest of the world. So God is on the move in cross-cultural mission from everywhere to everywhere. But a second way in which God is on the move, not only through the mass migration of people and refugees and the planting of diaspora churches across the globe, but he's also moving in the recovery of the gospel and the renewal of the church. The recovery of the gospel and the renewal of the church. Again, we were sort of having a missiological chat yesterday, a few of us, and I was again reflecting on, from the first century, the early church, beginning in the Middle East, moving in Europe, as the apostles took the message out, and Christianity took root in Europe. And then we went through a period that in history is referred to as the Dark Ages. Did you study history? You heard that expression, the Dark Ages. What was the Dark Ages? It was a time when the light of the gospel was dim, and Europe was engulfed in a flame of other religion, particularly Islam, but also in the rise of strong pagan influences. And Christianity retreated to the monasteries. The monastic movement emerged, and it is within the monasteries that the gospel was kept alive, and the flame of the gospel was kept alive. But in the monastic movement, the gospel survived. But not only in the monasteries, but also as the monasteries became more scholastic, and it was the age of scholasticism, sort of, pretty arid theology, another movement emerged, the mystics, the age of the mystics, the Christian mystics, who wanted to have a strong sense of piety, strong sense of devotion, a strong sense of commitment to the gospel. So you have people like Thomas à Kempis in the Netherlands, The Imitation of Christ, which became a Christian classic. And so the gospel survived the Dark Ages. The gospel emerged into the Reformation. We had a new renewal of the gospel. The Reformation was about many things, including the translation of the Bible into the vernacular of various cultures, English and German and so on. So through the Bible and Bible translation work, the gospel survived, and the church was renewed in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. And then we, as it were, went through another period of dark ages. And who knows where we are in the 21st century? It may very well be that we're entering another period of the Dark Ages. And how will the gospel survive? Where will be the light of the gospel? Through the church. That was Paul's vision. He says, it is through the church that the manifold wisdom of God will be proclaimed. How is the church doing in Europe? So the gospel has gone through periods of recovery, through persecution, through what the Europeans have contributed, and we're going to talk about that a little bit, the contribution of Europe to the global church, through which emerged a theology of mission that emerged out of Germany called the Missio Dei, God's mission in the world. We'll mention that in a moment, and to what we now have in the 21st century, the global church, the globalized church that is everywhere. And then thirdly, this is the outline of my presentation. In what way is God on the move? He's moving through mass migration and refugees. He's moving through the recovery of the gospel, through the churches. And thirdly, is on the move through the restoration of Christian foundation. Christian foundation. What do I mean by that? As Lars mentioned this morning, this, in liturgical ways, is the season of Pentecost. Post-Easter and the ascension of Christ and the sending of the Spirit. We are in a season of Pentecost from the first century. And then in the 20th century and now in the 21st century, we have the rise of the global phenomenon of the Pentecostal movement. So a third of Christians on the planet today are Pentecostals, 1/3. And Pentecostalism is spread around the world and is a major feature of our contemporary church life, the restoration of Christian foundation. But also, of course, we see the restoration through the Reformation in the 16th century, and in the politics and society network that I have been part of here at ELF. We are continuing to reflect on the 500th anniversary of the Reformation and how that affects politics and society. And the Reformation was a major period of European history. I've spent 30 years of my young life studying the Reformation in all its forms. And it was a significant part of European history and continues today. It's not over. It continues in many ways. And then lastly, in the restoration of Christian foundations, we have the whole Pentecostal movement. We have the reform of the church continuing. And then we have the movement of what we call the revival movement through the 19th to the 21st century. The revival movement, the prayer movement. Much of the spread of the gospel across Africa has emerged through its antecedent, which was movements of prayer. Strong movements of prayer in Africa and in Latin America contributed to the rise of Christianity and the spread of Christianity in Africa. This was a project that emerged at the time of the Eurozone crisis, around 2009, 2010, Spain, Greece, Ireland, Italy, several countries in Europe were on the verge of collapse, defaulting on their external debt. And the question was, will Germany remain the only country that's bailing out these? Many had to turn to the International Monetary Fund. And so Europe was in crisis. It's called the Eurozone crisis. And now we have Brexit. The British have had a referendum and they've voted to leave the European Union. But last year, 2017, was the French presidential election, remarkable election. One side, we had Marine Le Pen campaigning for France to leave the European Union. And of course, Macron had the opposite view and his view prevailed. And in France, this project emerged. A world without Europe. Imagine a world without Europe. So Europe is more than the European Union. The European Union comprises, 28 countries. Europe itself has over 40 countries. And will Europe survive? Well, the response has been that Europe has made a major contribution to the rise of Western civilization. Europe was at the center of modern democracy, the modern capitalist economy, global trade. Europe has contributed so much to the world in terms of scholarship, and so much to the world in terms of the advance of knowledge. So Europe has been significant to the world. That's a fact of history. But now Europe is going through a period of almost self-doubt and self-questioning about its own survival. And the question is, whither Europe? Where is Europe going? And for us, the fundamental question is, where is the church in Europe today? And so, in the context of my topic, God is on the move. How does Europe fit in? This is a book that was, as far as I know, only published in French, A World Without Europe, a contribution of various scholars reflecting on what that would be like if Europe was not a part of the global environment of the world today. There are various studies, demographic studies, about the projection over the next 30 years, what Christianity in the world will be like up to 2050. And these projections are based on population growth and fertility rates and a variety of factors. Again, these are studies done by the Pew Research Center in the United States, and you can look that up and study that. And you will see that the projection is for the global south, if you include Latin America, Africa, and Asia, you're looking at a dominance of about by 2050. Nearly 70% of Christians will be in these parts of the world. Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In 30 years from now, that's where Christianity will be dominant. Europe will only have 10%, 16%. North America will have 20%. So there's a projection of decline in Europe and in the United States. So there are other ways of graphing this, and I will give you this. You can actually look at this analysis, looking at the trend in the growth and spread of Christianity from 1910 up to 2005, and then up to 2050, the year 2050. And this is a breakdown in regions, pretty well giving the same data that I just gave you, but in a different way in regional spread. This particular graph, you can see the rise and the flattening of Christian presence in the Asia-Pacific area. The Caribbean, where I live, is expected the sharp rise and then a sort of leveling off. And in sub-Saharan Africa, you can see a steady growth. The Pew Center that put out the study last year, 2017, I just want to make just 3 quick observations from the graphics that I just showed you, that Christians were the largest religious group in the world in 2015, marking nearly a third. And again, they're doing this not only a study against population growth and Christianity, but against other religions as well within the population. All right? And then between 2015 and 2060, the world's population expected to increase by 32% to 9.6 billion. That's the projected increase in global population. And then the third bullet point, the number of Christians is projected to rise by 34%. So it's kind of a slow growth compared to the growth of the world population. Christianity will grow, but slowly over the next 30, 40 years. All right? This data is available, and we can all have a look at that. Now, Jeff Fontaine, who may have been at ALF, is a New Zealander living in the Netherlands, and is a researcher and a theologian presenter. Jeff had this to say, and this is an article he wrote in the Lausanne Global Analysis. This is an online journal of the Lausanne movement, which features articles on major phenomena affecting global evangelicalism and global Christian presence around the world. And this is what Jeff Fontaine wrote. Europe, he says, the most Christianized of all continents, has also exported atheism, rationalism, humanism, secularism, existentialism, communism, and plain unbelief to the far corners of the world. So Europe has made contributions both positively and negatively to the world. And then he goes on to say, if Europeans do not return to the life source which shaped their culture and society, that is the Bible, they will continue to spread, quote, unbelief in various forms globally. And then he made an observation, which I think all of us are aware of. Twice as many majority world students study in Europe than in America. And many return home to as unbelievers, to become lecturers, to become politicians, to become business leaders, and some government leaders, and shapers of their own society. So he said there's a great mission opportunity in Europe towards particularly foreign students, international students, a majority of them coming to study in Europe, who return to become individuals of influence in major sectors of society. And what is it that they're taking home from Europe back to their home countries? How then should we view Europe today? That's the question that he asked. And so on. Let me quickly, this is a pretty elaborate presentation. Let me just quickly give you an idea of some of the things that are occurring in different parts of the world. God is on the move in Africa, and we've already pointed out what happened. In 1910, at that first major global conference on world evangelization, there were just a handful, maybe 5 Africans present in 1910. And so by 2010, when the Lausanne movement had the 3rd Congress on world evangelization in Africa, it was placed in Africa. Africa was the host country, and there were 5,000 leaders from 198 countries that were present, majority from what is called the Global South. So there were the days I mentioned David Livingstone was the pioneer. This is a major phenomenon because David Livingstone spent a whole career in Africa, exploring Africa, from Southern Africa right up through the Zambezi, up to Victoria Falls, and he gave his life there. He never made one convert, not even one convert. And so the question, is, I remember about 40 years ago as a young theological student, writing an essay on the question, was David Livingstone a missionary? Certainly he was a scholar, he was an adventurer, he was an explorer, he learned many things, and he taught the world a lot about Africa, because he journaled everything he saw. But in terms of his Christian legacy, it wasn't much in terms of conversion and so on. And so in the Westminster Abbey in London, where he's buried, there's this wonderful gravestone of David Livingstone, missionary, traveler, philanthropist. He was born in Lancashire, Lanarkshire, in 1830, and he died in 1873. I mean, look on David Livingstone as a great leader. And yet, despite that, was he a failure? Was his missionary work a success? Despite that, a whole African church emerged, and then we had, in the whole patristic period of church history, we had some great African fathers of the church. Origen being one of them, Tertullian being one of them, and maybe the greatest of them was Augustine, who was born in North Africa, and has influenced Europe and influenced the West. In fact, when we talk about Luther, Martin Luther as a great reformer, we cannot talk about Luther without recognizing that his own background, he was a monk in an Augustinian monastery, whose life was transformed from the writings and teachings of Augustine. So Africa has been playing its part, in a sense, in influencing Europe in many ways. What's happening today in Africa? We could say a lot about what's going on. Tremendous things are happening there. The rise of mega churches all over Africa. And you can go to Nairobi, you can go to Accra, you can go to Lusaka. Wherever you go across Africa, the churches are alive, and tremendous things are happening. One of the churches they have now, one of the things that are happening in the churches in Africa now is the missionary vision of the African church, and they're spreading all over. Church of Pentecost in its international mission has spread all over the world. In Kiev, in Ukraine, one of the largest churches in Kiev is an African church. In Amsterdam, this is the Methodist Church in Amsterdam. You go to Toronto, and I was there a couple of years ago when Ghana was celebrating its 50th anniversary of independence. And you should be amazed at the Ghanaian Christians that came together in one place to celebrate their country's independence in Toronto, Canada. All right. One thing I wanted to point out in Africa, well, you know, as the modern missionary movement emerged and Africa became a focus, and so did Asia, as missionaries were leaving Europe and the United States to Asia and to Africa, and indeed to Latin America. Two men in Europe were very influential in setting out a sort of theology of mission or a theory of mission. How should mission operate? Henry Venn was the General Secretary of the Church Mission Society. He was the British guy. And Rufus Anderson was the American guy. And they wrote a lot about mission theory. And they came up with this model of mission. The mission should be a three-self model, so that the church, when planted in Africa, should become eventually self-supporting. It shouldn't be dependent on the West. It should be self-propagating. It should evangelize Africa. And it should be self-governing. This is the vision they had for the African church. It should be self-supporting, self-propagating, and self-governing. That's the theory of 19th century mission. And all the mission agencies around the world practiced that as they went out to the global south. What they did not, the sort of Venn-Anderson thesis, did not anticipate that eventually there will be a fourth self that will be added to the church that is planted in the global south. And that the church itself will grow up to become self-theologizing, that they will be able to write their own theology. And there's a lot of projects now. God is on the move in Africa and the African church, where African leaders who studied in the West, studied in Europe, have now gone back to Africa, and within their own cultural context are producing Bible commentaries, theological treatises, African Christian ethics. They're interacting with their culture, using some of the methodologies, the studies from Europe, and they're in fact building the African church. The African church is now being built by African leaders with contribution from the West, from Europe. Some of the African theologians, some of them are well-known. Lamin Sani, Professor Lamin Sani, is sort of the big guy from Guinea, West Africa. He wrote a book. He wrote many books. One of them is called Whose Religion is Christianity? Is Christianity a European religion, or is it African, Middle Eastern, whatever? Professor Kwame Bediako from Ghana, Tukumbo Adeyemo, and Tinyu in Francophone Africa, and my friend and colleague Kwabena, Professor Kwabena from Ghana, was writing a lot on African Pentecostal Christians. These are some voices. There are many others. Just a glimpse of what God is doing at the moment in Africa. I would say many other things. One of the things we haven't mentioned is African Enterprise. Last year we had Michael Cassidy with us. There's so much going on through Michael's ministry organization, and there are several leaders from African Enterprise who are here in ELF at this time. So what's happening in the Americas region? God is on the move in the Americas, and it's a fact that more than 1/3 of the world's Christians live in the Americas region, more than in any other region of the world. A lot of Christianity here just mushroomed from the early days of Catholic missions in Latin America. You will know, of course, that the pre-European contact with Latin America was evident in this place called Machu Picchu in Peru. And then the mission came, Christian mission came, and spread all across Africa, from the early days to the present time, so that David Stoll could write a book. Is Latin America turning Protestant? Catholic missions were so dominant to the extent that the first non-European pope in the Vatican is from Latin America, Pope Francis from Argentina. And so Catholicism was a major feature in Latin America. But now, with the spread of Christianity across the continent, the question is Latin America turning Protestant? That's David Stoll's book. Again, the projections are there. You can see what the projection, certainly what the trend was from 1910 to 2010 in Latin America region. One of the amazing phenomenon was Cuba has always had a revolutionary context from Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, and so on. It was a remarkable thing that Pope Jean Paul II went to Cuba. That was a sort of a younger Castro there on the left, meeting. He was fascinated with Pope Jean Paul to the extent that when Jean Paul died, one of the leaders, world leaders that attended his funeral was actually Fidel Castro, who went there and cried in the Vatican. And yet, religion is sort of circumscribed significantly in Cuba. But God is at work in Cuba, doing some tremendous things. Pope Benedict also went and visited Cuba, and I met an older Castro. It's in there on this corner, right? But among the indigenous people, you'll find God at work in a tremendous way, and we saw many of them in the conference in Bogota. The pre-revolutionary context I mentioned earlier. In Colombia, significant revolutionary violence, which there is no peace treaty, and that we could have the major continental congress on missions in Latin America, in Colombia, in Bogota recently. I could talk a lot about Pentecostalism in Chile. Lots of stuff going on there. The largest sort of mega church in Latin America is there. But this is happening in the context of poverty. It's one of the poorest regions of the world. There are 500,000 street children in poverty in Lima, Peru. It's just one of those amazing things. And so the emerging church in Latin America, where God is on the move, is really the church of the poor. And do they have anything to teach us about faith, about survival, about living there? One of my colleagues in mission is Pastor Dario Lopez in Lima, a Baptist pastor, who lives among the poor and carrying on a significant ministry there. I mentioned the Congress last August in Bogota. It's called Comebam. And out of this, they resolve over the next 10 years to raise up, recruit, train, and commission 25,000 missionaries from the continent to send out throughout the world. It was just a fantastic, this is a team of volunteers who ran the Congress. 1,800 of us were there, mostly, majority, 90% from the continent of Latin America, but there were guests from elsewhere. Several Europeans and Americans and Asians were also there. Some of the voices in Latin America, we know their names. That's Samuel Escobar on the right in the jacket. Samuel was due here last year. He's in Spain, Valencia at the moment. He originally was from Peru. Rene Padilla from Argentina. And Dicio in this corner here. Dicio was here with us at ELF last year. He was the leader of the Congress in August in Bogota. Valdir Sternagel from Brazil is here, one of the major leaders here. And of course, Rene's daughter Ruth is kind of the younger leader, new voice in Latin America. Tremendous things are happening there. In Asia Pacific, I know my time is up, so I'm going to run through this very, very quickly. What is God doing in Asia, in China, in East Asia, in Southeast Asia, in South Asia? What is God doing? One of the remarkable things that is happening in Southeast Asia is the way in which there is a strong vision to, again, recruit, train, mobilize Chinese believers to become missionaries in the world. And so there is a project called Mission China, where they are projecting, well, first of all, they're the first, second, and the third Congress preparing for this major event. And last time they had 1,200 students who gathered just last summer for this event, which I think took place in Korea. And they're trying to raise up about 1,000 Christians to go as missionaries around the world. But again, this is in a very difficult context. Just yesterday, while we were here at ELF, we had an email from one of the pastors in Beijing, where the government has kind of moved in, the local government has just moved in and is shutting down the house church that exists there. They have 1,800 believers in this house church, and they've cut off their water. They wanted them to have surveillance cameras, and the church pastors refused, and they're stopping their rent. They can't or no longer rent the property to have their church. And so a lot of different repressive measures are being brought against them, and they're asking us to pray for them. So the church is under pressure, and yet they have this strong vision to contribute to the world. God is on the move in the continent of Europe. And what does Europe have to contribute in the present time? We talked about their contribution in the past. What does Europe have to contribute today? I want to suggest three things as I kind of wrap this up. First, Europe has in the past and continues in the present to make a contribution to the global church in the area of leadership, theological leadership. It was this theology of mission called the Missio Dei, which came out of Germany in 1952, 4 years after the founding of the World Council of Churches. There was a WCC meeting in Germany on this theology of mission, the Missio Dei. And what is the Missio Dei? The Christian mission is not man's activity. It is what God has designed, it's God's work, and we're part of it. So the whole missionary enterprise is not our schemes and plans and long-term goals and projections and all that. It's what God is doing. It is His work. He's a sovereign God, and He's the one that does it. And there is, in fact, in Europe, as I will mention in a moment, within the Catholic Church, a whole new proposal for a re-evangelization of Europe. And so there's a new evangelism happening on the Catholic side. Certainly within the Protestant side, we will see that happen. It's also the case that the Lausanne movement, which is now a global movement, came out of Europe. It was in Lausanne, Switzerland in 1974 that the first was held. Again, European leadership hosted it, organized it, and although there were global leaders present, Billy Graham and his organization funded it, but it was a European location, European venture, and a European project to the world. Leadership in mission and in theology. And so there's a new global agenda, largely driven by Europe in the past, over the past 50 years, and it can continue. There's no reason why it should not continue. Europe has this contribution to make to the global church in the area of leadership, in mission and in theology. But this can be done in the 21st century. Not as it was done in the 19th century. In the 19th century, it was done in the sense of mission was, we want to go where no other mission organization was. That was the project in Africa and in Asia. My mission organization, whether it's from the Paris Mission Society, whether it was from the Norwegian Mission Society, we didn't want to go where others were. We wanted to break new ground. And all the mission agencies were doing that. In the 21st century, it's a different model. We have to work Christian mission in partnership. Someone has said the 21st century is the age of partnerships. And there are many, many partnerships that are taking place. We have to now partner with the global church in doing Missio Dei, global mission in the world. So, leadership, partnership, and thirdly, generosity. Europe has been generous and continues to be generous and needs to be even more generous to the global church in partnership. Openness to others, reaching new migrant groups in Europe and across the world. That's the new opportunity that Europe has to contribute to the global church, and so build the kingdom of God in the world. In Eurasia, last November, under the auspices of the Baptist Federation of Russia, 800 pastors, mission leaders, youth workers, and so on met in Moscow for the missions conference. And I was invited, and three of us were invited from the Lausanne movement, Nana Yao and Ole Magnus, myself. We were just absolutely amazed at the passion, on the vision, and the sort of the energy that they had for missions. They left with a plan to plant 700 new churches in and across Russia over the next 5 years. That was their goal. That was what they set themselves out to do, church planting inside Russia. They also wanted to be part of the global church, to become missionaries in partnership with the global church. We went to one of the Baptist churches in Moscow, and Pastor Pavel was there. He's right here in the photo. He's here at ELF. I said to him in Moscow, "You must come to ELF," and he sure is here with us at this time. That's him in his church, very large church in Moscow, and where he's a senior pastor. There are those who believe that Christianity has a default and de facto historical basis in Europe is gone, and now we are talking about the rise of a non-Christian Europe. This is from an article just 2 months ago in a British newspaper, The Guardian, really giving us some very significant statistics about the decline in the youth population across Europe in terms of their commitment to Christianity and to the faith. And the question is, why are young adults leaving the church? Some significant things are happening there. We have a great opportunity to reach out. Mary Eberstadt has written this book, How the West Really Lost God. Significant study, and there are all kinds of factors which contribute to that, which we can talk about, and we have been talking about in various things. A British journalist, Malcolm Muggeridge, in the 1970s, was a very influential guy. He was an atheist, sort of very vocal atheist. He was on the BBC television as a reporter, and written for other papers and so on. He wrote a book called The End of Christendom, in which he says, he was a cynic, how beautiful it all seemed at the time of the Enlightenment, that man triumphant would bring to pass that earth the paradise, whose groves of academe would ensure the realization forever of peace, plenty, beatitude, and beatitude in practice. But he says, what a nightmare. This is the 20th century of wars and famines and folly. So now the Enlightenment has produced a different outcome in Europe than was expected. And he says that's the end of Christendom. Christendom is no more. The question is, what is the missionary vision of the European church today? Andrew Waltz, I mentioned, this is the only book he's ever written. The Missionary Movement in Christian History. It's well worth your reading. There is a Global Mission Challenge. In the season of Pentecost, we have the word in the Acts, you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses to the ends of the earth. That is the missionary challenge for the European Church. I'll just go straight to the end of the presentation because I want to make a point of this passage of scripture here. In Psalm 11, verses 1 to 9, I believe it was Paul Tillich who preached a sermon on this text of scripture at the beginning of the 20th century. If the foundations are destroyed, what shall the righteous do? And when you reflect on Psalm 11, Psalm of David, that we've been hearing much about at ELF, David reflects in the psalm on the character of God in the midst of the wickedness and violence in the world, and the way in which mankind is on a very self-destructive path. He reflects on the character of the world, and he reflects on the character of God. The Lord is on his throne. The Lord is observing. He's examining what he hates and what he loves. And so his conclusion, the Lord assures the upright will see his face. There is hope. There is hope in the Lord as we continue. So the conclusion of this is the mission of God has not changed. And there is a new understanding of the mission of God in the world, a new Missio Dei. What has God called us to do? To go into the world, to proclaim the gospel, the good news of the life, the death, the resurrection, the ascension, and the coming again of the Lord Jesus Christ.
Amen. Thank you